Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another workshop series that we're organizing on behalf of the Debate Central Global Speech and Debate Council, Debating WhatsApp and No Issue Podium. Today, I'm going to be facilitating the session, and the topic for today's workshop is International Relations in Debate. International relations have a very wide discourse in terms of how debates operate because it's often common in out rounds as well as other sessions in terms of debate speeches and debate themes that we find it very relevant to. However, international relations is a very tricky subject matter. There are a lot of other things that you need to be very careful about when understanding how to do international relations in debate, while also understanding how international relations and theories under international relations have different effects and different methodologies in debate as well. So, in this workshop, we'll be doing a couple of things. One, we'll be discussing certain relevant IR theories and strategies, and also trying to provide you practical tips and feedback as to how to approach international relation debate motions, and also how to do better in terms of international relation debates over and beyond what generally is the acceptable standard. Of course, in some places, people have more awareness of international relations. Maybe if you're a lawyer or somebody who's read up more extensively on, say, international relations, it's much more likely that you have a better like foothold to hold in terms of this theme. So this workshop would be sort of an intermediate to a semi-advanced workshop where we'll be discussing particular theories and ideologies around how international relations apply on debate themes and how debate relevance is there under, say, international relation considerations and other different metrics that we need to sort of figure out. Over and beyond on this, what we'll be then going through again after that is a couple of discussions around how, say, different motions are to be analyzed in terms of international relation principles and themes, as well as concepts, and how to apply ourselves best to, say, international relations, ideologies, and frameworks when we are doing debate motions in this particular theme. What is then IR? That's the first fundamental question, right? So, international relation broadly can be classified as a distinct study of how different actors occur and also operate on the global paradigm and the global stage. So there might be different institutions which are occurring here where there might be also different international organizations or non-governmental organizations, corporations, individuals or states who are, say, having relationships with other individuals across the global forum. And these interactions and these analysis and frameworks are what are essentially within these international relations related motions or themes. What essentially happens here is that these particular actors, like states, have certain incentives and certain ways in which they operate. And in terms of certain places like international organizations like the UN and WTO, they also have certain standards and certain histories under which they operate, so on and so forth with the other like key actors that we are going to analyze throughout this workshop as well. So these give a unique perspective as to how they are operational in the global stage, but also what kind of interactions will be in terms of the moderation of those interactions. Like, will they be proactive? Will they be negative? Will they be something which is focused on one aspect or something which is focused on another aspect? So, all of these particular ideas or themes are very important when we are doing international relations related motions, and that is also something that will take clinically center stage when we are discussing things further in this particular workshop as well. So, in international relations, there are multiple things that are focused upon. There are issues like war, there are issues like peacetime operations, there are international laws and treaties. There's also the idea of how global economic relations are maintained and how trade is carried on between other places, while also discussing, say, human rights issues and environmental issues and security related matters. All of the key actors that we discussed operate very differently on issues of these particular natures and therefore have a very different ideology and perspectives behind it. It is too much to go in depth about all of these actors in this particular, say, workshop. So we will be giving you the basic concepts and ideologies around how international relation frameworks are operating and concepts are operating. And in due course, you will find content on the channel as well on the Debate Central, where you will find discussions around, say, how each individual actor operates in international relations, or how they operate in a global framework or an international framework. So that is beyond the scope of this workshop as to discussing specifics of how each and every actor will go ahead and have, say, certain interactions and certain like necessities when they're operating under these issues. But we'll try to then also give certain examples which will give you more ideas as to how these things work. The other thing that we sort of always would have a question when we are doing IR, right, is this discussion around the factor that why do we actually do IR in debates? So in debating, international relations become much more accessible motions when you're doing, say, a tournament in, say, another country, or say certain themes in the global diaspora, or the global framework of things are very important, or very like reticent as to how things operate and how things are going to be operating and going to be functioning, right? So I think that is the fundamental premise in this particular matter as well, as to how we are like more aware about international issues because of globalization and because of a lot of interactions between different communities and different social groups, that it becomes much more accessible for people to approach these themes much more charitably, and it becomes more accessible to debate for people as well, because a lot of people now know what is going on, say for example in Western countries. A lot of people are aware about issues, say in Ukraine and other places. So it's much more easier for us to say have these discussions and appropriate ideas exchanged when we are discussing different matters related to international relations in a particular motion set. um, the other sort of key thing that we do in terms of IR motions is to understand what kind of ways or motivations are provided in the IR theories and frameworks to analyze these motivations and predict relatable outcomes to what those actors have in terms of their intentions and what would justify their actions in this particular idea. So in this slide also you can see two example motions, right? This house would intervene in X country, or this house believes globalization has done more harm than good. Let's deal with this in terms of the ideation around the actor. So in this second motion, when we are discussing themes like or the issues like war and peace, or how trade or globalization has occurred in the world and how interchange of information occurs in the world, it's much more relevant to have these ideas or concepts when you are, say, focused on developing economies or developed economies, and have those relevant charms in terms of like the thought process behind it, right? So we're in this second motion, like how does globalization affect trade positively or it affects trade negatively? This might include aspects like cultural homogenization and other related aspects. So that is how you sort of analyze the motivations of different actors in the trade. So the US might have a very different motivation through globalization than what China might have in terms of how they're operating in the trade framework, right? Because maybe China has like a fundamental need to like expand their market space and to increase their exports, because that gives them a lot of like revenue structures in their own, say, economic models and economic operations. So all of these like motions have particular things that you need to analyze from the idea that this motion is trying to delve into. So for example, in the second one, when we are discussing if globalization is good or bad, essentially we discuss then the idea as to how globalization relates to these concepts around, say, economic operations, or say war and peace, or say human rights issues or environment, and how does this operate. An example could be that environmental issues have become more so often common because globalization has led to rapid urbanization and rapid consumerism and increased consumerism. It can also relate to ideas around how economic spheres are much more interconnected, which means that markets can become more stable because supply and demand can be more regulated effectively, and people might not be in dearth of supply in certain places where there might be acute shortage of certain products or commodities, because they can be like bolstered from other communities across the globe. So that might be a positive impact of globalization. So you can like predict outcomes and justify actions, and that would be something of an interesting idea to delve into and deal with when you're doing IR. So that is why IR is also very relevant when you're doing or discussing these particular themes. Now, concepts around IR are also fundamentally very important, because you would need to not be superficial in your arguments and rebuttals and case construction. It can easily be called out by an average reasonable voter also, or the like general spec individual who is going to have some amount of knowledge about international relations, right? Because it has now become such a common debating theme that it's much more likely that people have an awareness about what this debate should be based around and what are the interests or conflicting factual information or aspects around this idea. So you have to be careful when you're understanding these IR concepts, because that will help directly to adding depth and sophistication to your analysis beyond like simplistic stock arguments or claims that you can make in a debate. Now, let's dive then straight into what these IR concepts look like and what kind of like habitual things can you expect from IR motions and debating around IR motions. The first concept that we'll be discussing is sovereignty. So, by definition, sovereignty is this idea that every state has the full right to like govern themselves or have like complete independence over outside interference from outside sources or bodies. So this could simply mean, for example, the country that I am based in India has no like obligation to act according to what maybe the United States or Western powers ask them to do, because simply that they have their own sovereignty, which means this idea is that you are the supreme authority within your own country or your own like network, and you do not really need to have a way in which you need to respond to the limitations which are imposed on you by other states, or maybe like subscribe to the ideals or ideologies of other states in terms of how they are operating. So you have this entire idea of how you yourself are then going to be the governing power within your territory, and therefore you have territorial like integrity within your nation, and you don't really have any interruptions which are possible from outside. So there are two basic subsets, you can say, of sovereignty which you discuss, which is the internal and external sovereignty. So internal could simply mean that the person who is at the top level of governance has like the supreme authority within the territory in and of itself. This might be in some places the prime minister, this might be in some places the governing body or structure which is around the prime minister and other entities. This can be the president, like in the United States. On the other hand, external sovereignty is sort of like this independence from foreign control and foreign interference, but also it gives you like a recognition by other states. So, for example, India is a recognized state and a recognized sovereign nation where it has recognition from states like Russia, the US, UK, and other places, right? So, you have this external sovereignty, which is sort of giving you that idea about how you have the rights within your territory and you have the recognition of those rights in a global forum as well. So in debates, there are a lot of nuances that you need to deal with when you are doing aspects of analysis in terms of sovereignty. Like for instance, if you're doing a debate around intervention in X in violating the state's Y sovereignty and setting sort of like an ideological precedence, which is probably negative or not, you have to be concerned about how there are, say, responsibilities that states have, and there are certain rights and obligations that states have. For example, sovereignty can have like a responsibility to protect people. There might be sovereignty around, say, making decisions which are environmentally beneficial or not to your state, but also say the ideas around how human rights are going to be populated and human rights are going to be something which is important, or how global commons, like the globally commonly recognized areas like the international waters and other places are also respected, and how international security is dealt with, for instance. So when you are dealing with these issues in terms of a debate framework, when you're talking about sovereignty, you have to be careful about, say, balancing these state-led interests to how other states can interact with those interests. So when, say, for example, your sovereign state, which has complete territorial authority, does not like meet the standards of protection of their populations, or maybe does bad faith actions, that's much more likelihood that there are certain other mechanisms or lever mechanisms that applies internationally, where you are sort of going to clash with this idea and sort of give pressure point into this idea that this state has to become much more like a rational actor and do better in terms of that framework. So this could simply mean that you can call states out, for example, for not taking care of their citizens when their citizens are facing human rights issues. Examples can be Myanmar, examples can be Kiev and other disaster related areas, or there can be other issues as well. You can also call people out like for harboring terrorists, and there might be certain international discussions and international pressures around that, which can be seen in the recent issues in news as well in terms of how the world is operating. This could also, however, be something very simple, like how the Ever Given sort of blocked international waterways and trade between those international waterways because of how they are like going to be blocking the channel per se for continuing of the operation of seagoing vessels through the locks in terms of the region that they were in. So these things become also sovereign interest and global interest, and something which is very well dealt with in terms of the frameworks of international relations. The second core concept that we'll be discussing in is national interest. So, national interest is simply what kind of goal setting does a country do? Like, for instance, are they ambitious in terms of expanding their territory, whether they have any economic, military, or cultural or otherwise significant events or happenings around them? What kind of like interests would their citizens have? Like if there are minority groups in this particular countries, do they have different interests from majoritarian groups? And what this state essentially deals important in terms of how it would maintain its national security, how it will maintain its national prosperity, but how it can also like survive in the global forums and do better in global forums by exchanging, say, ideological preferences, but also say securing their own common interests or say their own specific interests in global forums like maybe the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank and other places, right? So these include key components like security, where maybe physical safety of the nation, like protecting its borders or territorial integrity, come into picture. But this can also be something as simple as economic prosperity, like are you going to be allowing import and export of trade? Is there an ability for, say, foreign exchange to happen? Is there an ability for foreign direct investment to happen? Will it allow a growth in these particular nations' interests or how they're going to utilize interests? So, for example, if a state is very natural resources rich, how are they going to be utilizing those natural resources? What are the motivations of them to do certain actions which are beneficial to the states in terms of maintaining their economic status, but also like improving their economic status as well? The third thing that you can sort of look at as a component of national interest is power and influence, where you sort of look at certain states like the US, where they have been globally dominant for a long period of time, and maybe say at a past where Soviet Union was also harboring, say, equal amount of clout against the United States as well. So every region, every country, every place has their own like regional settings and their own global standings in terms of how they're viewed in the state and how they are like perceived as utility in terms of their power and influence in these particular regions. So they have very different like perspectives globally. So you have to be very cognizant about what those interests of those states would be when they're exercising those power and influence in the global forum. This is way more specific in terms of how you are dealing with things like actor motions, because then it becomes very common that you have to be very careful about the actors' interests in terms of how they're stabilizing the economy, how they're like bringing power and influence, how they're meeting economic prosperity, how they're building security in their states, and so on and so forth. The last popular component here is the idea about ideological goals. So this is a very simple principle as to how maybe political systems operate in the states. Some states might be democratic, some states might be communistic, some states might be anarchic or monarchic in terms of that nature. So there might be monarchies or absolute authorities vested on, say, titular heads of states, or maybe there might be a democratic structure where people generally vote for electing their leaders, right? But there are different then preservations that these states have. So a state like Thailand, which has a king, or a state like India, which has a democratically elected government, has a very different like factor in terms of how those political machines will operate in a global forum, because they want to promote their own ideological goals. They might be promoting democracy, they might be promoting communism, they might be promoting any other aspect as well, but they want to also keep that ideological goal secure within their own national interest. So this simply means that they do not want interference from other states, where their own ideological motivations of running political systems get sort of in conflict with what other states might agree on or other states might do. So these are the four major components that you have to be very careful about when you're doing this IR motions, in terms of how you're dealing with security, how you're dealing with economic prosperity, how you're dealing with power and influence, and how you're dealing with ideological goals. Now, in debates, let's just look at this idea. So, you can have an example here where you can motivate the engagement metrics on, say, a debate by, say, engaging with the idea that the policy could preserve national interest, because sometimes it might boost your economic or enhancing your security questions. So, I think the way you can approach these particular debates or motions is simply giving yourself these ideas as to how you ask yourself the right questions within the debate framework as well as the debate motion. So you can ask yourself, like, what is the national interest of this actor, or what is the national interest that is being considered as part of this motion, and how do you best deal with it? So, is it something that the government is going to be doing? Is it something that people are going to be doing? Are some specific groups involved in it? Are the specific groups getting benefits, or who is the one getting benefit? How are you preserving these national interests? The other couple of things you can ask is simply if the state's intended goals are actually met, or are they, say, promoting economic prosperity for themselves? Are they providing any sort of like security interests? Are they providing any sort of like non-conflicting ideas from what their political systems are, so on and so forth? So the best way of approaching, say, the principled and practical awareness about how these particular motions are to be structured in terms of giving particular speeches is stating exactly what the intentions and what the methodologies would be for these actors and benefiting towards them as well. So keeping these questions in mind and asking what kind of preservation interest they have, what kind of political interest they have, what kind of other interest they have, would give you certain ideas to run a debate on, regardless of you having, say, the capability of understanding everything, because you might not have specific knowledge about a particular actor or a particular like global issue which might be on discussion in that particular round within your motion, right? So you can continuously like still build some amount of stock argumentations, because most states are motivated to maintain their economic interests. Most states are maintaining their, say, political goals by not going ahead and then completely changing their political system. So some amount of stock argumentation is still available to you and accessible to you, even when you do not have, say, maybe a huge amount of spectator knowledge or, say, historical knowledge about those states. So those are the couple of tips that I can give you in terms of understanding what national interests are. The third core concept about, say, IR, and I'm just going to take a pause here and going to give you an idea. You can take any like concept in terms of these discussions and have a question about them. I'm very happy to engage with everybody here. So if you have any question, please feel free to raise your hand. I will be checking the chat. I'm joined in from two devices, so it should not be an issue for me. So you can ask me at any point of time or drop it in the chat. I will probably see it from there and answer you in due time if you are uncomfortable unmuting and speaking at any point of time. Okay. Let me just quickly take a swig of water before we proceed with the third concept. So the third concept about power is essentially very important as well in our discussion, simply around the ideological differences that power has in terms of states' operations in global forums. So a state might be very motivated to do certain things when they are very like predominantly goal setting by, say, going in and, say, intersecting in places like Afghanistan, because they're very against the issues of, say, um, communism in the state, or maybe some other principles spreading in the state. So there are these particular motivations, like US as an actor has a global interest or vested interest in fighting wars beyond its borders, where it prevents terrorism and prevents other, say, gross delineations against human rights as it is claimed by a lot of people. So these discussions are predominantly very important in terms of analyzing how power works. So what we can sort of term power is also sort of how, say, you can refer to it as the currency of international relations as well. So basically it is how much power or influence as an actor in the global discussion or the global um, framework has over, say, other actors in that framework. So basically if actor A has the influence of actor over actor B to do something, and if actor B would do so if the actor says so, and if the actor would not do so, then what are the repercussions maybe which are possible. So there are many types of powers which are wielded. There are soft power and hard power. Hard power is essentially the idea that you can coerce people to take certain steps or actions simply around the ideological differences can be like imparted on them by a forceful or impactful way. What I mean by this is simply around the idea that you can maybe have economic or severe military sanctions which goes against this particular state, which means that you sort of like completely cut off these actors from international institutions, prevent their exports happening into your country, also apply a lot of military force, which might be, say, for example, in the case of Afghanistan, Iraq, and all the other previous wars, are also recently in Ukraine, in Israel and other places as well, if we can take examples. So one relevant example that you can have is also the economic sanctions, which is on, say, Russia from the Western powers, where you are trying to like impose a change within the, say, second actor in this particular discussion. Now, the second type of analysis that we're doing in terms of how power operates is soft power. So the idea of soft power is very different from hard power. Hard power, while it is coercive in nature, very direct and upfront, probably, soft power is, however, much different. So it attracts ideas and rationals based on, say, popular culture in these places, on political upheaval, on political ideas, and policy. So it has a much more softer touch, which simply means that it doesn't take a very standoffish approach. It takes sort of like an intersectional approach where you can intersect different ideas and concepts like culture, political ideologies, and so on and so forth to bring certain changes within the sphere of influence of this particular state, or maybe making some political changes. Like you can bring about a revolution, you can bring about political protest, you can bring about the idea that your state is maybe not giving you enough, which is why you can sort of go ahead and do something. This can also look like the idea of you sending people into, say, another foreign power and having them take some sort of action where you are making the society operate better off by taking away the problems in terms of, say, maybe a political regime which is very problematic in that state, or so on and so forth. It's not always that these actors have the best intentions. So even if you're applying hard power or soft power, you will often be able to see that there are certain ways in which these powers are very problematic, that they're exercising power beyond what they should be, and also like creating a lot of like challenges in terms of how they're operating in terms of these states. We have seen this countless amount of times, how unnecessary influence can lead to like problems. This might be the formation of terrorist groups by the CIA. These might be Guantanamo Bay torture chambers or other discussions which have happened over in global forums, and also reported upon extensively. So the operation of hard and soft power operates simultaneously in a global forum. So you have to be also cognizant as to how a state, until what extent does a state apply soft power and is capable of applying soft power, until what extent is it capable of applying hard power as well. So let's take another example here. So if, for example, you are in, say, a South American state, and you want some influence to pass on to, say, another state about your culture, your traditions, and so on, you can invest in, say, cultural exchange programs. You can invite students, or you can send trainers, facilitators, and they will be doing like goodwill achievements. Will try to train people, and that sort of helps them build better and do better. So as I was saying, there's always a like mix of hard power and soft power, which is what I have mentioned here as smart power as well, which is something that you need to always consider, because no state always wants to go completely gung ho into, say, coercing other states to act. It is very rarely that you would see a complete negation of any soft power exercise. So it's usually always a combination of both hard and soft power, which is in operation in states in terms of convincing, or say maintaining the national interest of actor A to persuade actor B to do some things which are beyond, say, the realm of actor A's state, and also actor A's territorial integrity, but does have their own political goals and national interests at the forefront. Now, there are a lot of consequences when you're exercising these particular nuanced policy mechanisms. One of them being that there are extensive amount of back and forth that happens within, say, hard power and soft power operating. So you have to be careful in terms of understanding how maybe certain actions are legitimate or not. So maybe if you are, say, US, who is going into another state, or maybe say state A who is going to attack another state B, there needs to be a justification on your operation on hard power as well, as to if you're going to do direct economic sanction or direct like military intervention. You need to understand, like, is it something which is legitimate and effective or not, and how they're like sort of working in the context of society. The other thing that you need to be sort of careful about when you're debating these particular ideas is also the consequences of how different states have different ideas of power, and also different abilities of exercising those powers. So if you go on and do practice these particular ideas and nuances, the more you develop into these sort of thought processes as well, and the ways in which you are operating these particular ideas, or three core concepts that we have discussed till now. As we finish the core concepts, we'll be discussing very briefly about the major IR theories that are operating usually within the tenets of international relations and global frameworks. There are three: liberalism, realism, and constructivism. I'll not be going into constructivism so much, but we'll be starting off with realism. So, realism is this idea within international relations that the states are the primary actors and are always rational and unitary. The international system is anarchic, where there is no overarching authority. There's no like international forum which can really do any sort of like justifiable benefit towards the community, and the states always will prioritize their own securities and their own power. Here, there are certain exercises of power which have been seen to be very key. The one would be, say, the military exercise of power. And in realism, also, the other principle is that there will be conflict. There is no like ability for conflict to not occur in society. This might be in different forms, like this might be military conflict, this might be economical conflict, this might be political conflict in political forums like the United States, the United Nations, and the UNGA, the UN Security Council. So in realism, it is also therefore believed that because conflict is inevitable and there is so much of conflict which is usually occurring across states, cooperation is also equally as difficult because people might not find it easy to meet common ground in their belief systems. And therefore, even if cooperation does occur, there might be things that can break those cooperations, and these cooperations are usually short term or temporary. So, how do you use this concept in debates, right? How to use the concept of realism in debates? So you can argue for policies which are based on self-interest and securities because states will have some amount of sovereign interest, some amount of like interest in terms of maintaining their security and operations, which means that there might be some benefit of deriving those ideas into your policy frameworks for that debate. The second way that you can do this is sort of explaining why states can be not that willing to approach international agreements or might not always have altruistic actions in terms of those international agreements. The good example that can be taken here is, say, maybe the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, where most states are sort of like participating in it, but there are some states which are very skeptical of these agreements and of these sort of like discussions happening in global forums. So there is always a balance here as well. There are not all states who will be skeptical. There are not all states who will be accepting and non-skeptical. So you have to sort of give the modulation as to why, or say the background as to why those actors should be skeptical or should not be, say, interested in following through with these international agreements or altruistic actions. The third idea is sort of this preservation or potential threats that occur in this particular debate, right? So there might be the utility here for realism to operate in understanding potential threats and the need for stronger deterrence and stronger defense. For example, if maybe you are debating on a motion where it is relatively about war or conflict in a region, it is much more likely that realism would be a good operation model here because you might simply say that national interest, protecting their minority groups, protecting their majority groups, and protecting people from, say, overtures or other problems that might occur because of other actors' belligerency or problems might be something which is very potentially motivating for an actor or a particular regional power to sort of justify their actions from. So, here, you can discuss ideas around security dilemma, balance of power, self-help, and self ideology or self-inflicted actualizations in terms of the states having sort of utility in terms of their power dynamics, but also the idea that they're exercising in terms of protecting their own sovereign interests and their own national interests, which we discussed at higher concepts on the three prongs as well. So that deals with realism. So the second idea is liberalism or idealism. So this is sort of fundamentally antithetical towards realism. So this system still believes in anarchic, but there is much more possible cooperation and beneficial cooperation, which is much more likely to be believed in when you're talking about liberalism. So liberalism means that there might be sort of key tenets in international systems where there might be much more chance for you to have a common ground, much more possibility for international institutions to do better. And there is a need for, say, international institutions like the UN, the World Trade Organization, the operation of international law, the proposition of democracy or the propagation of democracy, rather, in terms of different states adopting democracy and then becoming more democratic as institutional leaders in terms of their states and allowing institutional frameworks to be stronger in the states, which can also be beneficial in terms of economic interdependence. So, what this essentially means is that there are much more scopes in terms of the liberalistic ideology, that there is possibility for international operations to be much more fruitful, to be done under international institutions, and that international law does much more better in terms of addressing certain international conflicts like cases against different individuals in different states, criminal action, things like maritime protection, and things like border security and other things, and resolving conflicts and creating treaties between states. The most important thing about liberalism is this idea about economic interdependence as well. Because I think even realism, if not so much. In liberalism, you can sort of have this ideology around how economies are better effectuated because of globalization, how economies are maybe better off in terms of promoting, say, this vast global framework of supply and demand, because it simply means that there's a better economies of scale and there's much more possibility for more goods and services to be available in different markets where it was predominantly not available before. So all of these things become important in this idea. So then what happens when this operation occurs of international institutions, international laws, and that cooperation is possible? These can sort of then go into mitigating conflict and promoting peace between different global actors. So maybe not so much in realism, but in liberalism again, non-state actors like international governmental organizations or non-governmental organizations also play like a significant role in terms of how they're operating. So let's just see how we apply liberalism to debate then. So there might be a good and strong case for diplomacy under certain motions. So this can simply mean that you can argue for maybe international cooperation to be the right way of, say, doing certain actions in the global forums. But also in strengthening international law, you could argue that there is a much more possibility for much more universalism in terms of how states operate, which might mean that there is an ease of burdens in different states and different processes, which would inherently then give benefits towards a lot of people. So the other way maybe is to highlight the benefits of trade, the benefits of interdependence in preventing conflict. So, for example, if you're very dependent on another, say, state to provide you with some amount of, say, supply in terms of food or other stuff, it is far less likely than that you will go into war with that state. So, those are the couple of things that can sort of be a very important consideration here. So, in terms of how interdependence operate, how peace operates in terms of this particular regions, how collectively you can secure your regions better, or how collectively you can become more economically stronger. All of these things become sort of like an ideological thing that you can operate with under liberalism, and utility in terms of the debates can occur through this ideological aspects, right? This can also lead to, say, aspects like international cooperative movements like the Asian, and so on and so forth, which are operating among regional groups and promoting regional ideas. So dealing with those two like major hierarchy theories, the last one is constructivism, where you have these ideas, norms, and identities which shape state behavior. Um, I'm not going too much in depth into this, but this is sort of like a balanced probability between realism and idealism. And constructivism does help a lot more in terms of framing things around. And you have to be careful in terms of those aspects. So we've discussed so much IR concepts and so many like IR theories. Let's just try and give certain example motions a try. So in this motion, like this house would militarily intervene to stop humanitarian crises. The first thing that I would possibly do when I'm prepping for IR motions in a particular round is sort of break down the motion into different segments, like what kind of topical issues are being talked about and so many things operating. Those are the first couple of things that we'll sort of be discussing in this particular motion, right? Because I usually tell my students or maybe people that I have trained for debate that it's best to always operate on smaller chunks of the motion. So if you mean to break it down into, say, militarily intervene, stop humanitarian and crisis, you can have different links between different segments of the motion, which will give you an idea as to how to operate within this motion. So for example, you can talk about what does it mean when you're doing military operations in humanitarian crises? What do crisis situations look like? What does intervention mean here? What does humanitarian mean here? So this directly leads into this idea that there are six fundamental questions that you can always ask yourself to give yourself certain material in a debate framework as well, right? Or seven, you can say. Who, what, why, where, when, how, right? So when you ask yourself these six or seven questions in terms of framing it within the framework of how the motion is read, it's usually capable for you that it's usually able, um, it's usually much more like possible for you to then give better ideas in terms of what kind of cross-sectional themes operate within this motion and what kind of stock things you can argue and what kind of ideas that you can sort of like address. But it also clears out the burden in a motion and what are the actors and stakeholders in this motion. So it's always a good activity to do. So let's look at this motion from a realistic perspective, right? So in terms of four, intervention could only serve as a clear national security interest. then only it should be followed. Like, for example, preventing refugee flows that destabilize a region, or stopping maybe a state which has mass weapons of destruction from projecting their power and misutilizing these weapons of mass destructions. This, in terms of government, would like focus on power projection. Sadly, it's a very hard stance to take. It's a very problematic stance to take as well. But that's what sort of like the realistic perspective from Gov case would look like here. For op here, on the other hand, you can sort of simply ideate around the idea of how intervention can be very costly, risky, prone to likely unsucceed, or maybe have problems in terms of its operation. And there's not really a very clear-cut strategic gain for going ahead and doing intervention in states, which is why they might argue that states have a better priority in terms of doing better for their own citizens, and therefore this entire risk versus reward discussion comes around, and it's probably that risk is something which is weighed out more when you're doing it from, say, the opposition. Let's do the liberal perspective next. So in four, the moral imperative becomes much more considerable. So are you like morally doing the right thing by not intervening? Are you upholding international norms and laws or not? Are you preventing the, say, maybe genocide of a particular segment of population? So all of these things also are important considerations when you're looking at the for case from a liberal perspective. And there can be, say, internationally sanctioned like operations, like the UN has maybe troops, peacekeeping forces going to these regions and other things as well. So against, it can mean from a liberalistic perspective that you probably have things worsening because you are not really dealing the best amount of effect in terms of efficiency in these particular systems. You're not letting systems stabilize themselves, so the regions will become unstabilized. There might be a larger potential problems in terms of how governmental institutions operate and how other things operate. So you can sort of like discuss those things and ideate around those in terms of how you're going against from the liberal perspective. I'm going to wait a bit in terms of how we are in the second discussion part. We are going to do this motion next. I would prefer if you all also participate. I know there are only a couple of people in the meeting right now. So if you want to give a try, you can go ahead and try this motion out. Otherwise, we'll take a few minutes of breather before we continue on discussing this particular motion. I see there's a message in the chat. I'll just quickly check that as well. You feel that most debaters rely too much on realism when arguing state behavior. In a debate setting, should I challenge that with more liberal or constructivist assumptions? You need to. I think there's a good possibility for you to balance out this particular idea gap that most debaters have. So I think what applies here is that people believe that logic is only true when you're doing it from a realistic perspective in certain cases. I've also seen debaters face a lot of trouble when they're doing these particular ways of argumentation. So you have to be uh, very careful. So you have to also be very careful and cognizant as to what kind of principles can be operative beneficially or not to your particular actor or stakeholder in the debate. I'll give you a couple of examples. And I'll also discuss this with you further after we conclude this example motion number two as well. I hope that answers your question, Tawang. If you feel free to discuss a follow-up or drop a follow-up question if you have any. Also, this particular question is a bit subjective. So you need to be very aware about where particularly debaters are leading this motion to. Um, so you have to be sort of cognizant what kind of biases are they portraying, what kind of framework are they building in terms of the policy narrative. Then you can sort of like always have like them challenged through a more liberal or constructivist assertions. You should not make assumptions in debate, so be careful about that. Okay, let's just take a quick breather and then we can also reconvene and start the next half. Would any of you want to try? You can unmute yourself or drop a message on the chat. What would your ideas be doing this motion from a realistic or a realism or liberalism perspective? Okay, I was referring to the chat as well. I think there's nothing which has been dropped here. So let's just continue the discussions as well. Okay, I think somebody has dropped a text now. Give me a second. Yes, from a realistic perspective, economic sanctions doesn't always achieve stated political goals. You have to understand there is a bit of a discussion metric around this as well. So, for example, in some places, economic sanctions can achieve political goals when a state is overtly reliant on economic operations from global leaders and global states or other states in their region. There might be motivations to then have certain changes occur or certain things that are benefited from them occur there. Otherwise, there are some usually consideration that many states have like loopholes which they exploit when they're given economic sanctions. So that's true. I think that can be something that is also viewed. So let's go and discuss what this motion is all about. So, in example motion 2, this House believes that economic sanctions are an effective tool of foreign policy. The realistic perspective for I'm again, these are just ideas. I'm not discussing the entire motion in depth into how much you can do in terms of the realist or say liberalistic perspective. We are just giving certain ideas for you to think critically of this motion and then sort of help yourself when you're doing motions yourself later on. So, from a realistic perspective, sanctions can become a tool of hard power, can weaken, say, somebody's economy or military capabilities because you, of course, need to fund the military, you need to fund the population's ability to meet basic necessities, so on and so forth. So, that can mean that there are certain policy changes that can be coerced uh, for the state to be operating into, like they might be persuaded to take a different stance on certain things or do things differently because it can be very hard for them to operate. They are sometimes again not going to be as operative because there might be states finding ways around them, which is what the opposition case will be, as also somebody was mentioning in the chat that there might be certain problems in terms of not achieving the stated political goals, which we also saw in terms of the example that we had around Russia and the economic sanctions not meeting all of the targets that it intended to. So states in against can find like black markets and alternative partners which can help them do things better in terms of a global market. So these sanctions may harm the sanctioning state's economy too, because they might have, say, an inability to meet supply and demand issues because they have like economic sanctions and they have done political lobbying or have like a political stance on something, which means that they can't go against it, which would inherently mean that they'll have to stick with it, which could also weaken their economic perspective because they might not get goods for cheaper anymore. They might not be capable of having the same amount of production of certain goods and commodities because the state simply might not have the natural resources for them, and so on and so forth. A good example of this could be the gas which was supplied from Russia into Europe, and how that that became a major problem in the region as well. So there are different ways in which these can be sort of explained, but that would be again motion specific and how you're approaching it. But from a liberal perspective, I think for you usually do this ideation around how states are considered to be non-violent, like sanctions are considered to be, sorry, a non-violent alternative to war, which can be utilized towards informing people of the human rights or utilizing it towards like preserving human rights for people, and can be targeted towards causing the minimum amount of civilian conflicts in the state where they might be sort of like smart sanctions operating, where people are not like given so much of pressure in their daily livelihood, and then civilian interests are sort of like prioritized, and only certain harms are gone into which are gone into for the state machine to not be capable of operating, and that some things might not be possible for them to operate with. On the other hand, from the opposition perspective, it can sort of mean that there might be often harm that is done to innocent civilians disproportionately, which can become an ineffective tool if not universally applied, and therefore diplomatic efforts can be undermined or might be sort of like leading to resentment against certain states or certain actors. So you've done two motions now, in terms of how they're operating and how they're working. In this next segment, we'll be discussing shortly about how analyzing actors and their interests are sort of done within the framework of, say, IR motions, and how they're important in terms of these discussions, in terms of how they're operating within different global perspectives. For the first part, let's just look at who matters and what are like the people who are operating and who are beyond states. So, firstly, there are international government organizations, as we had also referred previously, like the UN, NATO, EU, World Bank, IMF, to take just a few names. There are also, say, interests that are there beyond states, like there are interests of promoting cooperation, there are enforcements of international law, which is prioritized. In some cases, there is like maintenance of peace, which is the priority. For example, if your region is unstabilized and you are a country which is bound to have more refugees coming into your state, you might be much more better off in trying to maintain the peace of the place where the refugees are coming for, so that your state does not have like a lot of excursions in terms of their economic capability and financial ability, and that their resources are not completely gone in terms of promoting and preventing harm towards other people who are not really their citizens coming into their states. Capabilities also like vary widely. There might be diplomatic pressuring, there might be peacekeeping forces, as we discussed, financial resources, and technical expertise. So, in terms of debate setting and in terms of how they're relevant to the debate, the first thing that you sort of look at is if you are being efficient or not towards this particular actor in terms of how you're operating for these actors or beyond these actors. You might also see that certain international institutions have political motivations, regardless of them being international institutions. Like the UN has to have certain UNSC mandates to go ahead and enforce certain things in states or maybe send peacekeeping forces. So there might also be problems in terms of how they're operating, in terms of how political systems are going to be utilizing uh, these international governmental organizations towards their own self-interest or towards their own political machineries or their own political motivations in a global forum. Sometimes you can also see that these international institutions might try to undermine sovereignty. This can be like if you're giving an economic bailout package to a country, you might impose harder like stipulations or terms for them to pay you back, and that might become a problem because that undermines how the sovereign state is operating within their own interests. Now, in terms of this next particular thing that we'll be discussing beyond, say, international government organizations, is the non-governmental organizations. Examples of these include things like Amnesty International, Doctors Without Borders, Human Rights Watch, so on and so forth. So, non-governmental organizations generally advocate for specific causes and is sort of like then discussed associated with those causes. For example, Human Rights Watch discusses around human rights and protecting human rights in different states across the world, and therefore their operations, their reporting, and so on and so forth also happens that way. Amnesty International similarly does the same thing, but Doctors Without Borders is focused on, say, providing medical attention and medical aid and also humanitarian aid. So there are different interests that non-governmental organizations operate within, but there are certain specific things, right, that they are advocating for specific causes which are relevant towards who they are and what they do. So they do have certain capabilities, like they can exercise lobbying power on states, they can increase public awareness on different things like human rights issues, providing like issues on the ground towards the global community, like they can have the global media cover certain things which are happening. They can work as information gathering tools, they can provide direct action or aid, like for example aid camps, providing food, providing relief, providing medical attention, and so on and so forth. So, what we utilize non-governmental organizations in international relations related motions for debate related things is the idea about how we can provide impacts on vulnerable groups. Maybe we can provide alternative perspectives because of the operation of these non-governmental organizations. And sometimes we can also utilize these to provide evidence. The next actor that we have beyond the state is MNCs. So MNCs, as we know, are multinational corporations. They have interests in profiteering and increasing their own access towards markets where they can resource fully acquire things which are cheaper in cost and then becomes more efficient in terms of how they are meeting demands for their own customers across the globe. So these can be ideas around, say, promoting economic lobbying and other things which are significantly going to be benefiting them. Their capabilities range from having economic influence in different states, like there are multinational corporations whose entire turnover in a year sometimes often way exceeds smaller states' GDP figures, and well as say budget figures in terms of a particular state's operation. So that might mean that they have a lot of economic lobbying power and a lot of possibility to exploit certain states, have influence over governments, and so on and so forth. So you can utilize it in debates by showcasing how you can maybe improve development, like for example, technological exchanges, improve labor standards or degrade labor standards, so on and so forth. Promote environment or degrade environment, how economies or local economies also operate when these multinational corporations come in. So these are different ways in which you can approach how MNCs operate and how MNCs are sort of like looking into in terms of states. The next particular thing are the other actors which are sort of there in IR debates. These can include people like groups, terrorist groups, rebel movements, global civil societies, and other particular institutional framework. They can also be people who are very influential globally, like Elon Musk is a very popular global figure, Warren Buffett is a very popular global figure, Jeff Bezos is a very popular global figure. So is Barack Obama after, say, his presidency, and also because he was the president of the United States. They have some amount of discursive power, or maybe some amount of, say, sway in terms of the way in which communities operate, in terms of how also things like economic systems operate, because they're also closely linked to, say, multinational corporations, states, NGOs, IGOs, so on and so forth, and how they're doing, say, certain activities. So what you essentially do when you're utilizing these particular other actors is identify what are their interests, how their interests and capabilities are, say, going to be affected in terms of how the society is operating, and so on and so forth. But all of these particular things that we discuss beyond the state have completely relevant ways in which they are operating in, but also completely important concepts which are being promoted at hand from them in terms of a debate setting, right? So there is often the possibility that these interests and capabilities are mandated or motivated through other influencers and other actors. And as we discussed, those are the ways in which you can address those questions for a debate and address how those capabilities are going to better effectuate your structures of arguments and your arguments in and of itself. So whatever we discussed till now is essentially going to lead into this next segment of structuring IR arguments in debate spaces, right? So you have to provide certain frameworks. You have to provide, say, an idea either about a problem, a mechanism, and a solution. So you can identify the relevant IR problem, which can be a threat to security, a violation of international law, problems around economic instability, and so on. You have to explain a mechanism as to why this problem exists using IR concepts, like if there is a security dilemma, if there's a possible failure of institutions, if there are pursuit of like conflicting national interests, or so on and so forth. And then at the end of the day, in your particular framework for analysis, provide a solution for how you're addressing these proposed policy changes in your problem. Um, by addressing these particular problems through your policy changes and considering different IR dynamics, like building trust, building power balances, leveraging institutions, promoting minority rights, promoting human rights, promoting environmental solutions, and so on and so forth, depending on how the motion is structured. The second framework is sort of around stakeholder analysis. So you'll need to identify key actors. So in actor motions, it's very obvious what the actors are, but otherwise also there are certain key actors which are always existing within motion themes as well, right? You will have to identify those actors and then understand what would their primary interests be and why do they want to promote those primary interests and how you are preserving those primary interests. So if they're affected by the how they're affected by the motion, and if they're affected in a certain way by the motion's framing, what kind of benefits or threats do you perceive, and how will they sort of like balance out in your framework is something that you need to discuss when you're doing stakeholder analysis, and how they're, say, a lot sort of like going into relevant IR theories and going to approach these IR theories towards their own self benefits or interests. An example could be a realist state which will act defensively to perceive threats. Like, for example, if somebody is like threatening a country with, say, nuclear destruction or mass destruction or other events, it's much more likely that there are certain like stowaways or ideas in which you can preserve certain things for your own state's operation or your own like country's security in terms of how they're operating. So a country will have a very different motivation as to how they are protecting their own national interests and considerations. So you have to be careful in terms of like doing those particular stakeholder analysis and the motivations of what the actors have as an incentive within their own, say, frames and within their own, say, operations and operational um, foresight. The last framework that I will sort of give you is the impact weighing with IR. So you have to always promote the idea as to how the magnitude of the problem is going to like affect you. So if there are like many states which are in problem or there are many people who are affected within the state, it's much more likely that that particular argument is much more clearer on a judge's sheets and also much more clearer in terms of explaining why you are addressing a particular harm or a benefit in a debate or in that particular motion, and then gives you a much more clearer perspective for doing so, and the judges will highly credit you for that as well. The second thing is you have to understand how it is probable to occur or not. You do not debate in absolute, so you can't really guarantee an outcome. You'll have to show why that outcome is in a scale of probability more likely to occur than not. And that is also something that you have to be contesting when you're discussing things. Like, for example, when you're discussing a real estate cooperating altruistically, or maybe you're discussing the idea about how certain states with a history of acting out, or maybe a history of other political systems or ideology, taking interest in other states' political ideologies or interests, and why that might be much more likely to motivate that state or that actor to like do certain actions within that outcome. Here, then, the only piece of key idea that is very important to take into consideration is that you're careful as to what you're prioritizing and who you're prioritizing it for. It's much more unlikely that China will not be a communist state tomorrow. So it's much more likely for you to like lose out on a probability in terms of running an argument of that sort. So you have to be very careful about what kind of realities do concepts in IR have and what kind of like mechanisms do concepts in IR have, and then essentially then run the debate accordingly to give the much more likely outcome which is possible within your argumentation, which is then going to be then weighed by you against the other team's arguments, and which will likely give you a win in that room. So you have to be careful in terms of how you're operating your ideas ahead with. So we gave you an idea about how the state actors operate, how other people beyond the state actors operate. So you'll have to likely do a likelihood analysis as to what is going to be beneficial or not in terms of those realities or in terms of those abilities for those actors to operate within. The next thing is time frame. So you have to sort of see that is it something which is only going to give you a short term benefit or a long term benefit, and which is more likely to be beneficial, which is tied into the second idea about how probability works as well. So you have to see if there is a probability that if you get immediate security but at the cost of, say, long term instability, it is far more likely that that argument is something which is not going to be as convincing or as beneficial, because it's not going to give you, say, a proper solution to the problem as well. And it might be something which is much more irrelevant towards how the debate motion would want you to debate this particular idea. Sometimes it is important where you are in an emergent need of a short-term solution. So you need to very clearly prove that why is it much more likely that that short-term solution is more necessary and is far more likely to be beneficial than the long-term consequences. Then only you can maybe sometimes run a short-termist argument in terms of how you are addressing, say, certain themes. The last thing then, in terms of impact weighing with IR, is the idea of precedent. So this can be something like does this action set like a dangerous or beneficial precedents in international relations? So are states likely to become bad actors if they continue following that idea in the future? And why it is much more likely to create a problem or not? So that is the last thing that you'll have to sort of consider when you're doing impact weighing with IR. Now, the last segment of this workshop, I know we are going a bit over time, is tips for research and integration. So when you're researching IR for debate or you're doing knowledge gathering or like analysis as to how different things operate, go for reputable sources. There are certain journals like the Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, International Security, Journal of Conflict Resolution, and so on and so forth, and a couple of others which are having good like citation scores and all that might be good for you to research from. So choose those sources carefully. The second type of sources that we could sort of like give you an idea about is this idea of think tanks, right? Because a lot of think tanks have good critical pieces of literature around a certain theme or topic. So you can approach certain think tanks like the Council on Foreign Relations, the Brookings, Chatham, Brand Corporation, sorry, International Crisis Group, and so on and so forth. Just do a particular background check and read from multiple sources so that you get a but better clarity on the concept as well. So there are certain press institutions as well that do in-depth analysis. Try to read from as many different political perspectives as possible when you're reading the news, be it from CNN, BBC, Reuters, AP, Economist, Times, so on and so forth, so that you have a balanced perspective and not just like one perspective on the spectrum, right? Now, you also, after reading, need to have your own explanation for events. Like, for example, why did the Cold War occur? You need to have the theoretical basis or if it. You can't just have the historical facts and say that that is going to win you the motion by stating facts. You sort of need to like understand what are the theoretical motivations or what are the constraints that you're operating within. And then you have to also study sort of how state behaviors and motivations occur. Keep in touch with the general application of states in different situations, like the US in conflict or Russian conflict and so on and so forth, so that you can have an effective application because people might find it more believable of US to do something that they've done in the past or some state to do something that they've done in the past in the future as well. And the last thing is that you have to be careful in analyzing the effectiveness of past policies so you can integrate that better into your ideology of why the policy that you are suggesting is far likely to succeed in that state as well. Now, when you're integrating IR into speeches, you have to be very clear that yes, I'm doing it from this perspective or I'm aligning with this ideology that I'm talking about interdependence and so on and so forth. If you just state facts without giving that theoretical analysis or maybe that particular well-defined argument and constructing it properly, it is far more likely that judges will downmark you for that as well. So you have to be careful as to why that coherency in your structure also matters, which leads into the next idea as well, right? That you have to always be coherent in terms of how the past political approaches and the past historical situations in IR have led the state to do certain actions, which might mean that you are more persuasive if you're building that coherent piece of framing in your own argumentation and principles, and also in your analysis of actors and international systems. And lastly, you have to be careful about strengthening impacts by showing how maybe a motion affecting core IR principles like stability, peace, or the balance of power, and you are then addressing a greater amount of populations or a greater amount of states, which means that you are more persuasive in your arguments because you're benefiting the larger group of people or the larger channel of people which is possible. So those are the couple of things that you can look at. Now, just before we go into Q&A, just a quick recap or conclusion to the workshop. So, international relations are powerful in terms of arguing and analyzing debates, not just in very specific IR motions, but also in motions which involve certain actors and certain political, economic, and other delineations, where you have certain influences of IR principles still occurring. Like, because in some economic motions, you'll see that there are globalized economies on operation. So, it's much more likely that IR is also sort of relevant in terms of those motions and those themes. This can also be for motions around law or say criminal justice systems or say human rights and so on and so forth. So you can have different analysis points and different engagement points when you're doing IR properly with other themes as well. So be careful in understanding these core concepts like sovereignty, national interest, and power, and be careful when you're applying major concepts like realism and liberalism. Do an impact analysis, but also weigh in from different perspectives, like from the realistic perspective or the liberalistic perspective, so that you have a much more well-structured argument and a well-rounded of argument where you're promoting the right like agenda or promoting the right system where you give the judge a clear picture as to why you're taking the debate holistically and offering a very fair comparative and balancing things out by explaining your concepts properly as well. So when you do these anticipate counter arguments, preempt arguments, build stronger cases for more impactful speeches, you would see that you're becoming more and more holistic in terms of how you're conducting argumentation, structuring your argument, and so forth. But in the last piece of advice I'll give you, IR has a lot of interchanging things, but it also has a lot of interchanging perspectives, interchanging mechanisms, interchanging actors, Each actors have diverse interests and diverse needs. They have competing interests also. They're sometimes directly in conflict with each other or indirectly opposed to each other because of their political support systems or their political integrations or their ideological differences, or there might be X number of things that can be considered. So when you are debating from these perspective of diverse actors or from the perspective of diverse institutions and other people, please be careful that you analyze the comparative properly, like you compare different ways and then this particular institution or place can operate, but also analyze carefully what kind of competing interests and other sakes and things are there, which are very core in terms of your nuances that you're delving into when you're doing impacts and framing. But yes, that's all for the theoretical part of the workshop as well as certain practical exercises that we did. Let's move on to question and answer. If there are any, please feel free to drop them in the chat or unmute and ask me at any point of time right now. Um, and we can take those questions now and then answer it. Right. So the first question I have is about, I'll just rephrase a bit about the previous question that was also asked. Since we had not dealt with the analysis of the actor, I had not answered it completely. Um, Now, when you're discussing state behavior, it's very predominant that state behavior operates on certain principles of economic sovereignty, which is also termed as fiscal sovereignty, but also territorial sovereignty and other interests of the state, right? So when debaters are usually applying too much of realism when arguing state behavior, it's because the perception of the state is very shallow in terms of their ideation also. States do not always operate in a unitary approach. They have different conflicting interests. So if your idea is there that this is the interest that the state has, it's much more easier for you to then, in the debate setting, do it with, say, constructivist or say liberalistic approaches and other approaches which are contradicting towards this. As I also recommended, it's much more beneficial if you give like a beneficial even if or impact weighing on, say, IR motions, where you simply have discussions around different frameworks so that you build a much more holistic argument which helps you impact better in a debate space and do better in terms of analysis. On the second question that you have, that your ideas about changing assumptions or applying assumptions or assertions, I think it's very carefully incapable of, like, you have to be very careful that you're not like becoming incapable of addressing certain claims in a debate, because assertions are not going to be like a very fruitful thing for you to do sometimes. Um, you have to be very careful as to what you're prioritizing in terms of argumentation as well. Some arguments are more persuasive, some arguments are more impactful because they're affecting the better amount of actors and so on and so forth. But yeah, I think that answers your question, hopefully. Thank you so much. If there are no other questions, we can sort of start wrapping up. Yes, Tawang, thank you as well for attending. Um, we hope that these things keep helping you. They're also up on YouTube over a period of time, so you can go back and refer to these videos as well. If there are no other questions, I think it's good for us to take a leave. Then, thank you so much for attending the workshop. It was very nice for having you all on board. And I'm very glad that I could give you some amount of perspectives into international relations. You can find our content on the YouTube channel, The Debate Central, where we have uploaded the past workshops and will continue doing so. Hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much for joining in.